What's up, everyone? Welcome back to 20 Minutes with Multz. So glad you're back for our third episode of the week. This time, we're going to be focused all on the New York Mets. Now, just like I did a deep dive into all things Yankees in 2022 in the last episode, this time I'll be joined by a fellow Boston University Terrier, Charlie DeMatteo of WTBU Radio will be joining me to talk all things New York Mets. We're also going to spend a little bit of time at the end talking Giants and Jets. Both teams off to great starts, like I've talked about, but both teams also getting active in the trade market this week. We'll talk about it all. Hope you enjoy my conversation with Charlie. If you like what you hear, please be sure to like and subscribe and comment down below any thoughts you have about the 2022 Mets and what you think their offseason will look like. Compare it and contrast it with the Yankees, or just give me your thoughts on what you think the Mets plan will be heading into next season. Without further ado, let's head right into my conversation with Charlie. All right, Charlie, thank you so much for joining today. Glad to have a Mets expert here to talk some team with us. How you doing today?
I'm good, yeah. I mean, it's a painful day to watch the Phillies in the World Series and having to root for the Astros, but that's what the season's come to.
I know I've never had a matchup where I care less about who wins, because I don't want a Philly team to win, and I definitely don't want the Astros to win. But, you know, I would imagine it's tougher as a Mets fan seeing as the earlier exit than the Yankees had.
Yeah, I mean, my main issue was with the Braves because I truly grew to hate the Braves this year. So when Philly took care of them, I was rooting for Philly. And I didn't really want to root for the Padres in the NLCS either because I don't know. The Joe Musgrove stuff didn't sit well with me. Maybe we can get your take on that. But now that the Yankees are out, as much as I don't love the history of the Astros, the recent history, I do like the group of players, the new group of players they have now. And while I find this Philly team really likable, it's the Phillies. So it's kind of just like, I don't want them to win. And I don't want another freaking NL East team who, just scratched their way into the postseason to win another World Series. That's going to be, if Phillies win, it's going to be 3 in, 4 seasons or whatever it is from the NL East. And all of which are like Cinderella runs where they're the most likable team ever. And they're awful franchises, from a Mets perspective.
And they all beat the same juggernaut Houston Astros. That's really the most incredible part. Is I also, as much as it would pain me to have to say it, you have to respect the Houston Astros. The amount of talent they've lost in the last few years, and they're still the best team in the American League by a country mile. It really does deserve respect. Game has to recognize game, but it's also amazing that in every World Series they've made since 2017 now, it's been against that underdog NL East team. The last 2 of them beat them in 6 or 7 games. Now it's the Phillies' chance. I think this is the most lopsided matchup in favor of Houston out of the 3, but that didn't stop the Nats and it didn't stop the Braves. So no, I personally predicted the Astros to sweep this series. I was very in favor of the teams facing the Astros in their playoff matchups. I predicted longer series, and Houston hasn't lost this postseason. They're just too good, in my opinion. Maybe they don't sweep. Maybe now I've gotten a little bit too bold of saying it's going to be too pro Houston, but I don't see how the Phillies stop them.
Here's the thing. All season long with the Phillies, whenever we played them, I said, this is going to be a series where the lineup wakes up. And it never happened. We dominated them all year long. We got to Nola every time we faced him, except one start where DeGrom outdueled him. And we got to Wheeler every start we faced them, and their lineup stunk. Early in the season, too, even when Harper was around, they just couldn't get it going. And they had these deflating losses against us where they blew a 7-1 lead. And they lost a game where we had Jose Buto start, and he gave up like 5 runs in a third of a game, right? And their lineup has finally clicked. And because of that, I can see the Phillies winning this in less than 7 games, possibly. I know it sounds crazy to say, given how dominant the Astros are from top to bottom. And you could say the Phillies are probably heavily reliant on, 2 starting pitchers and even 1 or 2 relievers. Is Jose Solverado going to be able to, dial it up in the World Series? He's done great this postseason so far. So, I mean, I never thought the Braves were going to get past the Astros last year, and they did. I never thought the Phillies were going to get past the Cardinals, let alone the Braves, and then let alone the Padres. Now it's like I feel like the sky's the limit, and there's nothing holding them back. I mean, Bryce Harper is seemingly he's gone from the most overrated player in baseball to the most underrated. He's stepping up in crucial moments, which is I mean, that is such an invalue. You can't put a measure on that. How it
Finally
is
living
out
up
of
to the
big
value
game
of his
plan.
contract.
Yeah, and now it's like, well, maybe you should pay him more. It's going to happen, but I mean,
No,
if I had to make predictions, I'd say
years after this.
yeah, I'd say Phillies in 6 or 7. It's crazy to me, and I want the Astros to just show up like they show up all year long, all postseason long, and just show they're the better team, which they are. But if baseball is famous for one thing, it's not a meritocracy. Teams get hot. The Philadelphia Phillies were an awful baseball team for 3/4 of the year in terms of pitching, defense, fundamentals. What they've done in the postseason is they've limited defensive mistakes. There's still been a few. Their aces have shown up like crazy, and their big bats have shown up like crazy. I mean, Kyle Schwarber is the most infamous postseason bat in recent memory in Major League Baseball. Not to mention JT Realmuto, who's become a star, and then you add Bryce Harper and Rhys Hoskins, who's having this crazy storyline. And I mean, yeah, on paper you think Justin Verlander and Framber Valdez should be able to deal with them. But you also thought Max Fried was going to be able to deal with them, and he didn't. He got rocked. You thought Yu Darvish was going to be able to do it, and he didn't. He got rocked. So the more I see this Phillies lineup go up against top quality arms, the more I think they've got top quality bats, and they do have what it takes to win this World Series, as painful as that is to say.
I think the only difference is that Philly has not faced a pitching staff like Houston. And, I know that the Yankee offense in the ALCS, they were already having a bad October. I'm not going to defend the Yankees at all, but watching what the Houston pitching staff did to Seattle and New York, they have more depth and more high-end talent than any pitching staff I can think of in recent memory. And just like you're saying, if there's any one lineup that can beat Houston, it's Philly. I actually think it's the exact opposite. If there's any one pitching staff that can shut Philly's lineup down, it's Houston's. And I think, Houston's lineup is incredible in its own right. It's really impressive how hard it is to strike these hitters out. It's unbelievable. Aside from Jose Altuve, who has been horrendous in October, and that was really the one silver lining of the postseason, was the Yankees did very little to let Altuve get hot. But, you look at guys like Yordan Alvarez, who's not easy to strike out, Kyle Tucker, Alex Bregman, Yuli Gurriel. I mean, the Astros haven't changed the top 6 of their lineup, presumably for 6 months. They've all stayed healthy, and they're all still that talented. So we're going to agree to disagree on this one, just like we used to all the time on the radio show. You're taking the Phillies in this one. I personally don't think they have a modicum of a chance, despite what's true about their hot hitters, their good pitchers, and especially Wheeler and Nola. But now let's dive in specifically to the Mets. That's what we're here for. They obviously won 101 games, but they couldn't close it out against the Braves, had to play in the wild card round. And before we talk a little bit about the postseason, I want to talk about a couple of things that led up to it. So as we know, bringing in Daniel Vogelbach, Tyler Naquin, Darren Ruff, and Michael Givens, that was the Mets trade deadline. Yep. And you compare it to a team like Seattle that went out and got Luis Castillo, or a team like the Padres that sold their entire future to bring in pieces to win now. And you compare that to the Mets. I mean, what was your reaction originally? And obviously, look at the lack of impact those guys had and how you think the organization handled it.
Well, at the time, I was mad. And I wasn't mad that we didn't go out and get a big bat, because I don't think we really – I don't want to say we did need more power. And they didn't want to go trade Alvarez or Beatty or Mauricio, which I understood. And Daniel Vogelbach quickly became a bit of a cult hero, really popular. And his OPS was top 2, if not the best, of traded bats at the deadline. And one thing GM Billy Epler said postseason was, I don't have any regrets because I don't want to trade away the future of our franchise, because what him and Steve Cohen are trying to, preach about, which may seem a bit, eyebrow raising, is sustainability from within. Like, you're not going to be able to re-sign DeGrom, Nimmo, Diaz, all these guys. You can't have, a payroll over $400 million. I mean, maybe you can, but they'd rather grow Brett Beatty and Francisco Alvarez and maybe Mark Vientos into guys that can be players, and then sprinkle on top, you're maybe Shohei Ohtani, or, you extend Pete Alonso and McNeil. And that's how you build a winning team. So at the trade deadline, All I wanted was a left-handed reliever, which we never got. And ironically, Joely Rodriguez was phenomenal the second half of the season. And the bullpen, which is what all Mets fans, that was the target of Mets fans' anger, not the bats that we didn't get. Because had Starling Marte stayed healthy, I think we would have went on to win the division, which is what we would have wanted, right? But our concern was we want to win a World Series. And to do that, you need a really good bullpen. And we didn't think we had that. Tyler McGill, I don't think any Met fan was confident he was going to transition to the bullpen well. David Peterson, in the limited opportunities, he was awful against that Yankee game. But other than that, he was pretty good. And Joely Rodriguez, the other lefty, was pretty good too. And Diaz, Ottavino, Lugo, and Smith were all lights out. So that wasn't an issue. So at the end of the season, I didn't have a big issue with the lack of moves at the trade deadline. Yes, it would have been nice to go get, Wilson Contreras or someone like JD Martinez, a good DH, because DH was really the plague of our offense. But with Steve Cohen at the helm now, there's a confidence among Mets fans. This isn't going to be the last time. This season won't be the only time in the next decade that we're, making a World Series push, playoff push. And because of that, they did hold on to their prospects a bit more. And people are saying, oh, well, you're going to lose DeGrom and you might lose, Nimmo. This was the time to strike. I'm thinking it from the opposite perspective. For the first time in a few decades, there's a sense of leadership at the top that is willing to invest big money into this organization. We have not had that under the Wilpons. So because of that, you can afford to play the long game. Am I disappointed that we didn't, go balls to the wall and get, a huge name? A little bit, but I don't think that was the cause of our downfall. We'll get into that. But the deadline for me, and I don't speak for all Met fans, but it's kind of split half and half. Some are, still hung up on it, and some are like, guys, we got bounced because our pitching, our strength didn't show up. Like Max Scherzer and Jacob deGrom they were going to take us as far as this team was going to go, right? And they didn't show up. That's why we didn't, make it to the World Series, not because we didn't trade for a lefty reliever at the deadline.
Well, I think it was more Scherzer and Chris Bassett, who's a name I haven't heard you bring up yet. DeGrom's Game 2 start against the Padres was actually really good, considering it didn't look like he had his A-plus command, and he still gutted out a quality start. But yeah, then you look at the other two games that were pitched, and
I think of DeGrom in Atlanta. DeGrom showed this year he was capable of dominating that Atlanta lineup, and he didn't do it that night. Yeah,
he also had some really bad games later down the stretch against teams like Oakland and Pittsburgh. I think the story of the Mets end of the season, it's less what happened in Atlanta. That was really the final nail in the coffin. What really did it for them was losing games you cannot lose to arguably the three worst teams in baseball in 2022. Swept by the Chicago Cubs, the Oakland A's, the Chicago Cubs, and the Pittsburgh Pirates. Losing games to those teams, it's inexcusable. I mean, the Yankees certainly had a handful of losses like that too earlier in the season. They lost a couple of games to the Royals. They, I believe, lost the series they played against the Cincinnati Reds, which was heartbreaking because that was really the beginning of Clay Holmes' downfall and Luis Severino's injury and a whole bunch of other bad stuff. But, blowing it earlier in September led to that Braves series being as important as it was. The Mets had the division locked up, per se. They were cruising to a slim, but nevertheless earned division title. And then they had to go to Atlanta and
just win a game.
Yeah,
you had to win a game. Your three best starters lined up, and they didn't show up. And I'm disappointed that Scherzer and we paid Max Scherzer all that money for 2 starts, and in those 2 starts, he did not show up the way that we paid him to.
Not to mention, he also missed over 10 starts because of injuries. And I'll say one last thing here before you continue is the one thing I think we need to start contrasting a little bit is a lot of starting pitchers, especially the aces in New York, Scherzer and Cole, make ridiculous amounts of money, and it would be a totally separate discussion if they were worth the contracts they got or not. But Garrett Cole did everything in his power to erase the narratives about him. Yes, he served up 5,000 home runs in the regular season. Yes, he is the reason the Yankees lost in the wild card game in 2021. But the Yankees do not get to the ALCS in 2022 without him. And he put his heart and soul into that game against the Astros in Game 3. And, I'm not going to go into Boone pulling him for Lou Trevino because then I'll be ranting for 2 hours. But by the exact opposite tone, like you were just saying, Scherzer did not show up against the Braves in that last start, and he was awful against the Padres. They hit 4 home runs in that game. And Scherzer was not as prone to the long ball as Garrett Cole. Not to mention, like I was saying, he made about 22 starts, which means essentially he was making about $2 million a game. They better be the best 22 games of the entire season, and some of them weren't, including the 2 biggest ones of the year.
And the positive I take away from it is that some of them were. His first start back from his second stint in the IL, there's 6 perfect innings in a game to clinch our playoff berth. And we're like, great. Yeah, this is Max Scherzer. And I can't fault the front office. I know we talked about this, back at the beginning of the season in the spring, like, is it really wise to pay a 37-something-year-old this much money? And we're like, well, this team wants to win. And in the big games, you need a big game pitcher. Max Scherzer has proved he can do that. And he just didn't show up. And is that down to his age? Does he not have the stuff? God, I hope not, because then we're screwed for the next 3 years. But I saw enough in the regular season to show that he is still a dog, and he still does have elite stuff. So, yeah, I think Bassett, on the other hand, if we don't re-sign him, I'm okay with it. I love him.
Take a page out of the New York Yankees book. Oakland Athletics starting pitchers do not do well in New York.
Oh, and he can't.
It's amazing to me that Brian Cashman didn't learn his lesson with the Sonny Gray trade 5 years ago and decided to go get another Oakland Athletics starting pitcher who I thought it was impossible to be worse than Sonny Gray was as a Yankee. He was, basically average in 2017, and he was supposed to be better than that. And he was really bad in 2018, and that's why he got traded. Frankie Montas was worse than Sonny Gray was at his lowest point. Now, that was probably because he was still injured. His shoulder never healed, and the Yankees kind of forced him back when they did, and then forced him back into the playoffs because they traded basically their entire crop of pitching prospects for him, and he had to pitch. But, he didn't pitch well. And Chris Bassett had a really solid regular season. I remember I said back in the spring that I wanted the Yankees to get Chris Bassett from the A's because I thought he was the best Oakland starter. And we can both agree that if we're talking about Oakland starters, thank goodness neither of our teams got Sean Manaea because he was so bad in San Diego, they booted him to the bullpen. But when you're pitching for the Oakland A's, one of the smallest market teams that's used to pitching in front of 5,000 to 6,000 fans a night, and then you head over to New York, where if you're on the Yankees, it's 45,000 people a night, or the Mets with this newfound sense of hope with Stevie Cohen and all that talent in the payroll, you're facing 40,000 fans a night staring at you, cheering you on.
It's just different.
They couldn't handle it.
Yeah, and I think it was evident in his press conference. He had some weird quotes early in the season, how, he was talking about Mets fans. I think the world's ending when they lose a game. Yeah, there's a sense of that. It's New York. But it was clear after the Atlanta game, I didn't trust him. I wasn't going to trust him in the postseason because he had shown he could do it against Atlanta early in the season. He had some great starts against them. But maybe it's just this sense of, we blew this lead, and it was just too much, and it overcame him. And I don't think he was actually awful in the Padres game. I think he made one terrible pitch to Austin Nola. He was going to get out of the inning. He was up 0-2, and he hang a breaking ball and a 2-run single, and that was the end of that. But with Chris Bassett, I like him. He's a good personality. The clubhouse liked him, and he was as steady as you can be in the regular season. A big part of why we won 101 games. But as we transition into this new Steve Cohen era, go ask the Dodgers. The regular season means diddly squat. All right, you have to show up when it counts, and I don't trust Chris Bassett's big game pitching enough. I know it's small sample size, yes, but some of the things he was saying in press conferences, rubbed me the wrong way. And so we're going to get into offseason, but yeah, he's not someone I would be desperate to re-sign.
Well, you talk about small sample sizes, but, like you said before, it's New York. It's going to be magnified 100 times. Look at Garrett Cole. Despite the fact that he had pitched well in 2020, the COVID season, he pitched well in that postseason. Nobody cared because the one playoff start he made in 2021 was a disaster, and it cost the Yankees a playoff run. So people's minds can be shaped that quickly in a place like New York. Yeah. And I do agree with what you said about Bassett. He's such a steady arm, but his big game pitching, if that's what it's going to be, and by the end of the year, you don't trust him, that's dangerous. And, on the Yankees side, it was the exact opposite. Luis Severino and Nestor Cortez came back from injuries in mid-September, got 2 or 3 starts to warm up, and they looked unhittable in those starts. And that kind of made you trust them a whole lot more going into the postseason. And they ended up having, solid postseasons, not perfect. It was never supposed to be perfect against the Astros, but it's kind of the opposing, tracks that those kinds of pitchers followed. So before we dive into offseason, I wanted to ask a couple more things about the Mets season that you also touched on. And it was a couple of specific positions, specifically catcher, designated hitter, and third base. Those 3 positions, for one reason or another, seem to be ones that the Mets could not figure out. The platoon of James McCann and Tomas Nido, as solid as it may be defensively, was last in baseball offensively. DH, we know what the problems were. Vogelback got ice cold after a few weeks, and Darren Ruff was a disaster. And as soon as Brett Beatty went down with the thumb injury, Eduardo Escobar got white hot in September, but still hit about 220 for the year, making $10 million. So, how much were you expecting to see the Mets struggle at those 3 positions when the season started?
Catcher, I fully expected. And the less we talk about James McCann, the better, because, gosh, he is just the target of Mets fans' fury and mine included. So I don't want to talk about that. Point of catcher, I love Tomas Nido. He's a great backup guy. He played really well down the stretch. James McCann might be top 5 worst free agent contract signings ever. Moving on. DH. Mets fans at the beginning of the season were all excited about DH. JD Davis, Dom Smith. Oh, we finally have guys, we can get them some run. And they were putrid. JD Davis, when he went to San Francisco, was great. Dom Smith is at a major career crossroads. He was awful this year. And then bringing in Vogelback, he was a fun addition. He was a bit too selective at the plate at times, but he still took his walks and hit a couple home runs. But you need more consistency at DH. And then third base was interesting because Eduardo Escobar, when he was brought in, was primarily veteran, decent power, not going to hit for average. And when you look at what he did over the year, that's kind of what you got. He didn't hit for average, but he hit close to 20 home runs, I think. And the clubhouse loved him. He was a great clubhouse guy, and he offered some good veteran leadership. And when you have someone like Brett Beatty coming up, it's okay to go get someone like Escobar as a stopgap, right? But moving on to next season, do I think Beatty's going to win that starting third base role? I'm not sure. He might spend the first part of next season in the minors, especially if Escobar continue. Like if he starts the season hot, which he might, and then go cold in June, that might be the end of Escobar, and Beatty might come up to replace him.
I just counter with one point about that, because that was one of the other things I wanted to talk about is the Mets' top prospects, and specifically the 3 hitters that would pretty much address the 3 positions that I brought up: catcher, DH, and third base, and that's Francisco Alvarez, Mark Vientos, and Brett Beatty. And what I wanted to talk about it and drill in was what I saw as a complete mismanagement of those prospects. I understood bringing Brett Beatty up in June. That one is not so much of the problem. They couldn't really do anything about the thumb injury. It was what it was. But I think because of how highly touted of a prospect he is, he has to win the opening day third base job. I don't see how, given that he's already gotten a decent taste of the majors, that he could start off in the minor leagues. The other 2 position players, Alvarez and Vientos, I think their seasons were totally mismanaged. I don't know why you would call up those guys in mid-September, right in the middle of that playoff push, and expect them to slide right in and be immediate impact players. They didn't really even play Francisco Alvarez until the last week of the season, and Mark Vientos really wasn't that good. I think the Mets have a chance to right that wrong next year with all of those guys up in the major leagues. If they think they're ready, they have to be there. You mentioned that the Mets held on to these guys, and I think the Yankees are in the same position. We could talk for years about how the Yankees have these top shortstop prospects, and they're going to pass up on an entire another class of elite free agent shortstops because of their prospects. Well, the only way you're going to get the fans on your side with those prospects is to play them. And I think for the Mets, going down the line, if they want to sustain this success, with the huge amount of free agents they might have, as we're going to get to in a little bit, then you've got to get these young guys up right away and let them show what they can do right away. So just wanted to throw that in there. But I think it's interesting that you say that Escobar's got the job over Brett Beatty.
I think that's because Beatty in the sample size didn't light the world on fire. He was below the Mendoza line. He had a couple home runs. But going on to the mismanagement of Vientos and Alvarez, I do agree to a certain extent. Vientos was, I think, just because we kind of needed a bat. Guillorme was down. Someone else was injured at the time. McNeil went down for a few days, and they just kept him up. But we're never really expecting big things from him, right? Alvarez, calling him up after the season he had in the minors for the biggest Mets regular season series in years was, to me, I looked at it, I was like, is this really happening? Like, holy cow, what if he goes crazy? I mean, you couldn't get worse than Darren Ruff as a right-handed DH. So my perspective was, if he goes 0 for 4, which he did against Max Fried, okay, fine. Ruff probably would have done the same thing. But if you catch lightning in a bottle, great. So with Alvarez, I didn't hate that because I think it was so small. His confidence isn't going to get rocked. He has a bit of a taste of big game baseball for a young guy, which is great. You saw what he could do. He had a couple lasers in the final series of the year against the Nationals. And that's going to be a learning curve because I don't expect him to be with the Mets to start the season next year. I expect to be soon after. But, I mean, he didn't play in AAA that much. Brett Beatty played in AAA for a week and then got called up. So it was a lot of bad timing. I don't want to call it unlucky timing, but it didn't suit the Mets in terms of you would have rather not had to call up Alvarez at all this year. You would have liked Darren Ruff to be the great right-handed, hitter off left-handed pitching that he is. He's been over the last few years in big spots too for the Giants. That didn't happen. So their hand was forced trying to find something in Alvarez or Vientos.
Maybe you could also say to the same degree that Brett Beatty shouldn't have ever been called up, but he had to be because earlier on in the season, the J.D. Davis situation, it still wasn't working out. And Eduardo Escobar wasn't hitting. Like we said, his season stats got a huge boost from the way he played in the last couple of weeks of the season where he dialed it up to a 12 out of 10. Other than that, it was a pretty pedestrian season for him, especially considering the money he's making. So we'll see what 2023 has in store for those guys. I think, like I said, for guys, maybe less so with Vientos, like you said, he's much more of a bat than an all-around prospect like Beatty or Alvarez. At this point, now that they are up in the major leagues, whether it was for a month or basically a day like Alvarez, I don't see how those guys can stay in the minor leagues. I don't know what the Mets can do about it, especially a catcher. Like you said, the James McCann signing was a disaster. And if you want to rank awful free agent signings, the Yankees have a list of about 20 that I can hand you that we can also throw on that list. But, we'll see where things go from there. So the last two things I want to talk about Mets related, it's both regular season and off-season related, and it's all about pitching. So first thing I want to talk about is the starting rotation. The Mets, more than any other team, had a reliance on older guys. Jacob deGrom, 33, 34 years old. Chris Bassett, 33 years old. Carlos Carrasco and Max Scherzer, both over the age of 35. All four of those guys were arguably your top four starting pitchers. That was going to be your playoff rotation in some order. Scherzer, deGrom, Bassett, and Carrasco. And, you've talked about it a lot. We talked about it a lot in the spring that this was a risky game for the Mets to play, relying so much on older starting pitchers. And now that we look ahead to the offseason, where deGrom is almost assuredly going to opt out and Carrasco is a free agent and Bassett might be gone too, do you think it's going to be too much of a shock to the organization and to the system for the Mets to go straight from 4 or 5 starting pitchers that are overtime, and older to guys that are younger?
No, I don't think so, only because that I have a lot of faith actually in a guy like David Peterson to fill one of those roles. And like I said, I mean, if you look at the field, like the Mets' goal under Steve Cohen is to win a World Series, right? This year, we showed that we can construct a great roster that won tons of games in the regular season because of great pitching. But then that great pitching didn't show up in those crucial games of the season, which maybe shows maybe we need to change our thinking. because the Mets' philosophy offensively all year was, lots of contact, stringing hits together, and great pitching. And that worked. And then the hitting went cold and the pitching went to shit, pardon my language, and then the season was done, right? So my wish list for offseason free agent pitching is Jacob deGrom. I'm really torn on. I really am. If you said to me, you can go get Carlos Rodon, but deGrom's going to leave, I would strongly consider that. I'm a huge Rodon fan. I think Max Scherzer is still an ace, and I think that he will show that. If there's someone I trust to prove their contract worth, I know it sounds crazy after two disaster starts at the end of the season, it's him. So if all of a sudden you're looking at Scherzer, Rodon, I think Carrasco has a team option, which I think they're going to pick up, and then Peterson, and then you still have maybe Tyler McGill, but if not, you go get someone else serviceable. Maybe you think about getting Taijuan Walker back, who was adequate throughout the season. But I think that the Mets are gonna accept that this elite pitching in their maybe past their prime was kind of this season's theme, but that's not going to be the theme of this franchise. They do want to have sustainable young players. I don't know how old Rodon is. He's definitely younger than deGrom.
He's going to be next year is his age 30 season.
30. All right, so he's right in his prime. He's someone I'd really target. But there's a part of me that thinks there's no way Steve Cohen is going to let deGrom leave. And it's so tough because I love Jacob deGrom. But is he worth what you're getting from him in terms of reliability? Is he worth $40 million a year? I don't know. I thought Max Scherzer was worth that. And when he played in the regular season, he was. And then when it came to the biggest games of the season, he didn't show up. And that's just what happens in baseball. So I'm fine with accepting we're not going to have two aces. Rodon's arguably an ace. Could you get Justin Verlander? Maybe. Could you get Eovaldi? That's someone I'd like to come to the Mets. So there are other options. And I don't think the Mets will, like you said, have a shock to their system if they lose deGrom. Bassett, I think, would be as big of a loss in the clubhouse because he was really popular as he will be on the mound in the regular season. But like I just said, I'm not super comfortable with him in the postseason. So I'm accepting the change. While it's a slippery slope, I'm accepting there's going to be some shifts. But I'm excited to give someone like David Peterson an opportunity because whenever he pitched this year, he looked really good as a starter. And I think there's still room to improve for him. So he's someone I think could fill a role. I still think Carrasco can be a number 4 or 5 guy. I wouldn't have touched him in the postseason. I think Taijuan Walker had earned that 4th spot if he had made it to the NLDS. That's another story. But yeah, I mean, off-season pitching, it's going to be a roller coaster. And I couldn't tell you what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, we're running short on time here, so I want to make sure we get a quick 2 cents in on football. But I think if I was to give my 2 cents, I think Jacob deGrom is gone. I think he's kind of had it in New York. I think he wants to move closer to home in Florida. I know the Braves are expected to be a big target for him, and that would break.
No. I know that would the Braves. It's
utterly break your heart.
Yeah.
But I will say this. I think you're absolutely right that who the heck knows what's going to happen in New York. The Mets, as I said, have the possibility to lose Carrasco, deGrom, Bassett, Taijuan Walker, and then in the bullpen, almost everybody as well. And I know we don't have a ton of time to touch on it, but I think you would agree the Mets bullpen also has a chance to look radically different next year. They have to decide whether or not to pay Edwin Diaz, as well as guys like Trevor May, Michael Givens, Adam Ottavino, Seth Lugo. That's a ton of talent that they could be losing. But before we go any further and before we run out of time, I want your quick 2 cents on the Jets' 5-2 start and the fact that, your thoughts on the Breece Hall injury and the fact that all they had to give up was a 6th-round pick for his replacement, James Robinson.
Well, it was a kick to the balls because especially seeing how long it's going to take him to get back to his best, it's probably not going to be until 2024 we see him back to what he is like now. With that being said, with the addition of Robinson, I love that, especially because we basically got him for nothing. But the bigger issue is Elijah Vera Tucker. He's out for the season. And that is, with the addition of Robinson, that's a bigger issue. And what I've loved about the Jets so far is they're gritty in their wins, but they'll also turn it on. And I just think losing Vera Tucker and Breece Hall, and we're going to be without Corey Davis against the Patriots, and then this whole Elijah Moore, it's like finally the Jets have put together a winning team. And then within a space of 2 days, it all goes to shit. It's just mind-boggling how unfortunate last week has been. But that being said, I love Sauce Gardner. I think Zach Wilson is showing promising signs. CJ Uzomah has been everything I wanted him to be. Garrett Wilson has shown flashes. But yeah, losing Breece Hall, it stinks. But I'm also more worried about losing, who has been our best offensive lineman in Elijah Vera Tucker.
Yeah, and I think, you talked about it as well with the culture and what could be going on with the Elijah Moore drama. And we saw the exact opposite with Denzel Mims. He requested a trade, and he's been pretty silent team player doing his job, waiting for his chance. So you like how that has changed. And I'll give my quick 2 cents on the Giants right now, because I think the exact opposite is happening, where Brian Daboll has built an incredible culture, and he kind of traded away a guy who seemed to be having a negative impact on that in Kadarius Toney, trading him to the Chiefs for their 3rd and a 6th. It's amazing that they got that much for him, considering he's played basically 1/4 of a game in 2022. And he showed so much promise with the few flashes in the pan we saw in 2021, but he's too injury prone. And now he's apparently saying he wasn't injured at all. And I guess that means he just wanted to get out of New York. Whatever the case may be, the Giants are 6-1. Their culture and their coaching has gotten them there. And I think doing everything they can to keep that as high as it is, keep the morale as high as it is a huge, huge positive. It's crazy to me to think that both the Giants and Jets are in the top 10 of the NFL power rankings when they were both in the bottom 5 when the year started. They're 11-3 combined. It's unbelievable. And just like, despite how bad our baseball team's seasons ended and how disappointed we are, and for the drama of the offseason that's coming up for both teams, at least for the time being, the hockey season's starting and the basketball season is starting. The Knicks look great. And then you got the NFL teams where the Giants and Jets are flying higher than anybody could have ever possibly imagined. All good things coming right now. Crazy to think with baseball ending, things are actually getting better. But with that being said, unfortunately, we are out of time. And Charlie, I really appreciate your time. I hope everything continues to go well this year at BU and with WTBU Sports. And hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
That's going to do it for this episode of 20 Minutes with Multz. Thank you all for sticking around. A little bit longer of an episode than usual, but when you get Charlie talking about the Mets, there's always going to be a lot to say. Hugely thankful to him and for his time today. Hope we'll have him back on for another episode soon in the future. Once again, if you like what you saw, please be sure to like and subscribe. Comment down below anything you've got to say about the New York Mets or the Giants and Jets, how you think they're doing and how you think the trades they made in this past week will affect their team down the line. We'll be back to 2 episodes next week. It'll probably stay 2 for a while until we get deep into the baseball offseason and there's lots of signings to talk about. Hopefully there'll be good news signings and not necessarily just the bad news ones of players walking and leaving for other franchises. All that to come down the line. For now, have a great weekend. I'm Daniel Multz. I'll talk to you guys again next week.